the love of God reaches to the depths. Even with mankind, it goes right down to the depths. I mean, it's very interesting. I'm not going to preach on that today, but it's very interesting to read that when Christ died on the cross, he actually descended into the depths, actually to release out of captivity souls that were held in captivity, if you want, in Hades or in hell, but then took them up into the height of heaven. But it's descriptive in the sense that the love of God is, I would say then, to a human point of view, the love of God is without description. It's indescribable in the sense that it's too vast. And I think all that Paul is trying to refer to here is the absolute vastness and scope and the compass of the love of God. You know, a lot of people questioned why, after I'd been in that communist prison all those years ago, I've got to think back, what's 50 years ago now, seems a long time. I was only 40 when I was arrested. And people questioned as to why I was so desperate to go back. But it was because when I was in the prison, yeah, come on. I was living in a desperate situation. You have to be in a communist prison to understand how degrading it is, how you're stripped of everything. You're never a name, you're only a number, and how they literally strip all your clothes, everything off you, and put you in prison garments, and they're filthy, torn. And anyway, I don't want to talk about the degradation. What I want to mention is my best friend in there was a murderer. He was the one who had the most compassion on me, and I don't know how I would have survived the early days and weeks without his help. But you see, I think this is why I preach as an evangelist with so much passion, is because I didn't see those men with me as the criminal, the murderer, the drug addict, the whatever they were. And they weren't political in my cell, they were criminal. I didn't see them like that. Living with them for a year, as I did, in different cells, of course, and 2 different prisons, I saw these men as to what God could do with them. I could see what God could make even of the murderer if he would just repent and come to Christ. And that's why I was preaching the gospel in the prison, because I saw the potential. And you know, eventually, years after I came out, and when I was evangelizing under communism in the Soviet Union, I remember in one city, and I called all the pastors together, obviously evangelizing. We had all the different denominations, the different pastors, and calling them together. And it was very interesting because sitting down at lunch with them, I found that all except one of those men had been in prison. And not necessarily for their Christian faith. Many of them, it was drug addiction, alcohol, and 1,000 things. And the only one that hadn't been in prison, it was because his father was the secretary of the Communist Party. But now today, these were the pastors, the men that God was going to use to transform Russia. And you know the story how that around about that time when I was preaching in that communist prison, I'm sure many of you have heard the story, and I was preaching to 1,400 men, and the commanding officer says, well, how can your God change these men? 200 are mass murderers, 400 are multiple sex offenders, and the rest are every kind of criminal. How can your God change these men? Yet, when I preached Christ and they repented out of their prison, out of 1,400 men, 140 of those murderers, sex offenders, and criminals became the pastors and the evangelists who were to pastor and evangelize Siberia. And when I went back after 25 years, they were still evangelizing. And they are the pastors of churches we founded. So you see, the compassion of God is so wonderful. But now I want to move on to what is my main thought from here, And that is in verse 20. Yes, all right, in verse 18, he's saying to be able to comprehend the expanse of God's love and to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, so that you might be filled with the fullness of God. Now, in verse 20, to him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think, according to the power that works in us. And you know, having looked at the extent of the love of Christ, now Paul is saying that not only the love, but he is able to do, Christ is able to do, Jesus Christ is able to do exceeding abundantly. Exceeding abundantly. I mean, that's expansive. I love some of these biblical words. I love the King James Version because I think sometimes the older English is so descriptive. Exceeding abundantly, above all that we can ask. So what God will do is, through Christ, give us more than we can ask. And you know, the reason I'm talking about, well, it also says not only ask, but even think. So in other words, that Jesus will give us not only what we're asking, but he'll give us our wildest dreams. And the problem is, too many of us, and you know, I think too many of us are restrictive in our prayer. I don't think we understand the willingness of God through Christ to do so much for us, if only we would ask.